The first warning sign wasn't the Dominion warships blotting out the sun. It was the silence that fell across the colony long before the shadows reached the ground, an instinctive hush, like the world itself bracing for impact. Miners looked up from their drills. Children stopped mid-laughter. Even the wind paused as though afraid to draw attention. Something immense and merciless was descending from the heavens. Commander Reeves stood at the edge of the main quarry, dust settling on his shoulders as he watched the sky darken with metallic mass. His breath came slow and measured, the way it always had before a storm he couldn't stop. He had never told most of the colony about his past. They saw him as a calm, reliable foreman, someone who kept schedules tight and tempers calm. A good man. A steady man. None of them knew that once, long ago, his name had echoed across battlefields. High above, the Gorath Dominion fleet arranged itself in a perfect crescent, a predatory smile carved into the atmosphere. Gunmetal hulls glinted against the sun. Engines growled like approaching thunder. And then the landing craft began their descent, too many to count, too purposeful to misinterpret. Around Reeve, people whispered, "Is it pirates? Resettlement inspectors? No, look at the formation. That's war. It's war." When the first landing craft slammed into the soil, it sent a shockwave rolling through the colony, rattling every tool, shaking dust from rooftops. The ramp hissed open, and the Gorath soldiers emerged, massive, broad-shouldered, skin ridged with bony plates that shimmered faintly beneath the sun. Their heavy boots struck the ground in perfect rhythm. Behind them marched a commander clad in black armor etched with Dominion sigils. His voice boomed across the colony through a voice amplifier embedded in his helm. "Humans of Outpost Theta 9. By decree of the Gorath Dominion, this world and all inhabitants now belong to us. Compliance will be rewarded. Resistance will be crushed." It was not a threat. It was a fact stated in a tone dripping with condescension. Miners and families were herded into lines. Unarmed, dusty, weary, they looked exactly as the Dominion expected. Workers. Laborers. Soft, fragile creatures from a garden world. Gorath soldiers barked orders and shoved people aside with armored claws. Children cried. Parents held them close. And still, the veterans were quiet. They blended into the crowd without fanfare, gray hair, stiff joints, lined faces. They looked like tired workers nearing retirement, not former soldiers who had survived horrors the Dominion had never faced. Their silence wasn't fear. It was calculation. It was memory. It was control. Reeves stepped into line with the others, hands at his sides, shoulders loose, gaze downcast. A Gorath soldier roughly shoved him in place. Reeve didn't react. He inhaled slowly, exhaled evenly. Inside, old instincts took shape like ghosts reforming from mist. Weapons. Troop patterns. Choke points. Blind angles. Supply lines. Every detail sharpened in his mind. The soldier sneered. "Downcast and quiet. Soft-boned things. You will make excellent laborers." Reeve said nothing. He reminded himself that retaliation now would doom everyone. Pride was a luxury. Precision was survival. The Gorath commander paced before the colony, surveying them the way one inspects livestock. "Human output is notoriously limited," he declared. "But your species possesses endurance if properly motivated. You will mine or at triple your current output. Failure will be corrected." Then came the chains. Metal restraints snapped over wrists and ankles with a brutal finality. Entire families were bound like packs of animals. Children whimpered as the cold metal tightened. Adults tried to soothe them despite their own fear. Reeve felt the chain lock around his wrists, the weight of it settling against old scars. He bowed his head, not in submission, but in patience. One of the younger men near him hissed under his breath. "We can take them. Look at their spacing. Look at—" Reeve cut him off with a single sharp glance. "Not yet." That was all it took. The younger man swallowed hard and lowered his eyes. Reeve's authority wasn't loud, and it didn't need to be. In another life, Men had followed him into places no sane soldier walked. The Gorath pushed the humans toward labor assignments. Tools were thrust into hands. Overseers barked orders. And throughout it all, a steady undercurrent of derision flowed from Dominion soldiers. Fragile things. Look how they tremble. They'll break in a week. But they were wrong. Humans didn't tremble. They observed. They endured. They waited. Reeve found himself placed in Drill Team 3, same as always. The Overseer, a hulking Gorath with jagged horns, glared at the humans like they were beneath notice. The miners lifted their drills, heavy machinery humming to life, and resumed the monotonous rhythm of cutting into the ore walls. Dust filled the air. The sun beat down. Sweat dripped. On the surface, everything looked normal. But beneath the noise, the veterans were whispering. Not with words, with glances, with subtle shifts of movement, with the unspoken language of people who had once depended on each other in places where hesitation meant death. No one else noticed. Certainly not the Gorath. Hours later, as the sun dipped low and cast crimson light across the quarry, a faint commotion broke out near the far end of the pit. A young worker, barely 20, collapsed from exhaustion. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. The Gorath Overseer marched toward him, nostrils flaring with disgust. Pathetic, the alien snarled. If you cannot stand, you are not needed. He struck the boy across the back with a rifle butt. The boy cried out, curling into himself as pain rippled through him. The colony froze. Civilians gasped, hands flying over mouths. The veterans went silent. Not fearful, not hesitant. Silent the way a storm is silent before the first bolt strikes. Reeve felt the tension in every veteran's muscles like it was his own. Old reflexes surged. Old wounds throbbed. The Overseer struck again, raising his weapon for a third blow. And Reeve moved. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply stepped forward. The Overseer froze mid-swing as Reeve placed himself between the weapon and the boy. The two locked eyes. Reeve's voice was calm. He is dehydrated. Let him stand. The Overseer snarled. You do not command here, human. Reeve didn't blink. He will stand. And he will work. But he needs water. The quarry seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled. The Overseer leaned in, towering over him. You are in no position to make demands. Reeve's gaze didn't waver. There was no bravado in it. No anger. Just quiet certainty. A certainty the Overseer didn't understand, and therefore feared. After a long moment, the alien lowered his weapon with a disgusted grunt. Fine. He gets water. But if any of you fall again, there will be no mercy. The Overseer stalked away. Reeve knelt beside the boy, lifting him with gentle hands. The boy's breath trembled, his eyes wide with fear and gratitude. Steady, Reeve murmured. You're all right. Breathe. The veterans around him subtly shifted closer, an unspoken ring of protection around the injured worker. And for the first time, civilians noticed. They saw how the older humans moved, how they watched, how they responded with a level of discipline that no miner had ever shown. It planted a seed. A question whispered in worried minds. Who are these people really? Reeve helped the boy return to the line. When he straightened, pain lanced through his own shoulder, an old injury from another lifetime, but he ignored it. He returned to his drill and resumed working as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. That night, as the humans were marched back to the barracks, the veterans exchanged small nods. Tiny confirmations. Silent agreements. This wasn't sustainable. The Gorath were escalating. And sooner or later, one of those escalations would require an answer. The sun set on a colony that looked compliant. But beneath the surface, the ground was shifting. Inside the barracks, Reeve sat on a metal bunk, elbows on his knees, listening to the rhythm of breathing around him. People were exhausted, bruised, terrified. Children whimpered quietly in their sleep. Adults tried to comfort them despite their own trembling hands. A fellow veteran, Mara, spoke from the bunk opposite him. Her voice was a whisper. "We can't let this continue." Reeve nodded. "I know. How long do we wait?" Reeve closed his eyes. Images of combat flickered across his mind like ghosts. Friends falling, smoke rising, screams echoing through comm channels. He had led too many into violence already. He had promised himself never again. But promises don't matter when children are in danger. "We wait," he said softly, "until we know we can win." Mara accepted this without argument. She trusted him more than she trusted herself. They all did. And so, quietly, the veterans began to watch more closely. They studied guard rotations, supply deliveries, sensor grids, weapon caches. They noted times when surveillance flickered. They mapped tunnels beneath the colony and routes through abandoned shafts. They trained civilians without ever calling it training. "Safety drills," they said. "Practice evacuations," they said. But every movement, every instruction, every quiet correction was building towards something larger. Something inevitable. The Gorth saw none of it. They saw only what their arrogance allowed them to see. Broken laborers bending under the weight of new masters. Days became weeks. Tension tightened like a wire drawn too far. Everyone felt it, even if they couldn't name it. Then one night, everything shifted. A faint, frantic scraping echoed from the ventilation grate near the water reclamation unit. Reeve moved toward the sound cautiously. A moment later, the grate swung open and a young Gorth tumbled inside, eyes wide with terror, breath coming in ragged bursts. "Please," he gasped. "Help me." Veterans moved instantly, surrounding him with the precision of a squad securing a perimeter. The Gorth raised trembling hands. I'm not here to harm you." Reeve stepped forward. "Why are you here?" "I had to warn you," the young alien stammered. "The Dominion, they're planning to relocate your colony. Not to another world. To the front lines." A cold silence fell. Reeve's voice dropped. "Explain." "They need bodies," the Gorth whispered. "They intend to use you as fodder. To overwhelm enemy trenches. Humans are durable. You last longer under fire. That's what they say." Fear rippled through the barracks, but beneath it, something else stirred. Rage. Controlled, quiet rage. Reeve's jaw tightened. "Why warn us?" The young Gorth swallowed hard. Because my brother died in a Dominion assault squad. They threw him at a fortified line with no support. He never had a chance. And now they want to do the same to you." Reeve studied him for a long, silent moment. The alien shook under his gaze. Finally, Reeve spoke. "Your name?" "Tarek." "Very well, Tarek. You did the right thing coming here." Tarek's eyes widened in relief. Reeve continued. "But now you must understand, your warning has consequences." Tarek blinked. What consequences?" Reeve leaned in, his voice low. "We no longer have the luxury of waiting." Around them, the veterans straightened, every spine aligned, every breath held, every eye burning with purpose. The wire had snapped. And when the sun rose, the Gorth Dominion would have no idea that the miners they enslaved were already beginning to rise. Night settled over Outpost Theta 9 like a shroud, thick and suffocating. The air tasted of metal and dust, and even the stars seemed dimmer, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Inside the barracks, Reeve stood in the center of a circle of exhausted, frightened people, while Tarek trembled under the scrutiny of 100 eyes. He was young for a Gorth, barely into adulthood by their standards. His skin had a bluish tinge, ridges still soft, armor patchy and ill-fitted. He did not look like the towering warriors who patrolled the camp. He looked like someone trying very hard not to break apart in fear. Reeve approached him slowly, his voice measured. "Explain exactly what the Dominion intends." Tarek's throat bobbed. "They plan to move your entire population to a war front on the Outer Rim. You won't be trained. You won't be armed. They're going to send wave after wave of you at enemy fortifications until something breaks. They don't care if it's the enemy." His voice cracked. "Or you." A ripple of horror passed through the barracks. Parents clutched their children closer. A few civilians trembled so hard they nearly fell off their bunks. Reeve didn't flinch. He had heard this kind of plan before, long ago, under a different banner, in a war he'd spent years trying to forget. The same cold logic. The same disregard for life. Some strategies recycled themselves across empires, no matter the species. "Why warn us?" Reeve asked quietly. Tarek swallowed again, as though the truth tasted bitter. "Because the Dominion doesn't see you as people. They see you as tools. But I've watched you. You work together. You look out for each other. You care for each other. My brother fought in the Dominion's vanguard. They used him up like they use everyone. He died before he saw 30 cycles." His voice shook with rage and grief. "I can't watch them do the same to another species." Reeve held his gaze for several long seconds, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once. "Thank you." A wave of tension eased from Tarek's shoulders, but only slightly. Reeve turned. "Mara. Jace. With me." The two veterans stepped to his side immediately. Mara, with her close-cropped gray hair and sharp eyes, and Jace, whose limp was the only visible reminder of the injuries that had once ended his military career. Reeve lowered his voice. "Spread word to the others. Quietly. Tonight begins preparations for contingency protocol." Mara's breath caught. "You mean?" "Yes," Reeve said. "We're past waiting." Jace nodded once, jaw tight. "Understood." The two slipped away into the barracks' darkness, weaving between bunks with the stealth of predators long accustomed to moving unseen. Reeve turned back to Tarek, who still looked on the verge of bolting. "You did a brave thing tonight," Reeve told him. "Stupid perhaps, but brave." Tarek blinked. "Does that mean you trust me?" "No," Reeve said. "But it means trust is possible." Tarek's shoulders sagged, relief mixing with uncertainty. "Stay close," Reeve said. "And stay quiet." The alien nodded shakily. Around them, the veterans were already moving, passing silent glances, subtle gestures. The room wasn't merely a barracks anymore. It was a staging ground. The uprising had begun. The next morning dawned red, not metaphorically, but literally. Dust storms from the northern ridge whipped sand across the horizon, tinting the rising sun like a smear of blood. It was fitting. The Goroth began their usual routine. Soldiers barked orders. Overseers strutted with their weapons in hand, eager to punish any sign of sluggishness. Humans filed into lines, appearing tired, compliant, beaten. But something was wrong. A subtle shift in posture. Eyes sharper. Steps more synchronized. Reeve noticed one overseer narrow his gaze suspiciously as the humans headed across the yard toward the quarry. He watched the column of workers. He sensed something he couldn't name. But Dominion arrogance was a powerful blinder. He shook his head and moved on. The humans got to work. Drills hummed. Or carts rattled. The usual monotonous symphony of labor resumed. Only Reeve and the veterans knew that this was camouflage. Beneath the surface, operations were already in motion. Mara worked the coolant pumps, diverting flow toward pipes no one monitored, pipes that would feed into the eastern sensor hub. Jace pretended to inspect drill bits while actually loosening key bolts on the guard tower's power relay. Other veterans repositioned mining equipment, creating lines of sight that seemed accidental but would allow coordinated strikes later. Even the civilians played their role, though most didn't know the full plan. They were told to pay attention to whistle signals, to move quickly, calmly, and in groups, to trust the veterans. Reeve knew how difficult it was to ask civilians to place their lives in others' hands. Trust was earned through action. That action would come soon enough. Around midday, Tarek slipped into the shadows of the equipment shed where Reeve was reviewing a circuit map scratched into the dirt. "I have something," Tarek whispered urgently. Reeve looked up. "The main comm tower will be offline tonight for maintenance. It's routine. No one will notice if it goes out for longer." Reeve's mind turned instantly. An offline comm tower would blind the Dominion's ability to call reinforcements or report an uprising in progress. It would also disrupt their internal surveillance. "What's the access point?" Reeve asked. Tarek knelt, drawing a crude schematic with a trembling claw. "Here. And here. 2 nodes you can sever without triggering alarms." Reeve nodded. "Good work." Tarek swallowed. "I want to help more. I can do more." Reeve studied him. The young alien's fear was real. So was his conscience. But in war, good intentions could kill. "We'll use what you've given us," Reeve said gently. "Nothing more for now." Tarek bowed his head. Reeve touched his shoulder once, brief but meaningful. "Courage is not always about action. Sometimes it's about restraint." Tarek blinked in surprise, then nodded slowly. The plan continued. When night fell, the colony transformed. From above, nothing looked different. The lights dimmed. The wind howled. Humans huddled in their barracks under blankets. But inside those barracks, hearts hammered in anticipation. Reeve stood before the gathered veterans, their faces illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the emergency strip lighting. "Our objective," Reeve said quietly, "is to take control of the colony with minimal casualties. We cannot win a direct fight, but we can dismantle their infrastructure and isolate them." Mara stepped forward. "We disable their eyes," she said. "Cut comms, blind sensors," Jace added. "Then we neutralize patrols before they realize what's happening." Reeve's eyes moved across the room. "Civilians will evacuate into the tunnels. No exceptions. If an area becomes compromised, you fall back. No heroics." Some veterans exchanged glances. They knew that when the moment came, heroics were inevitable. But Reeve needed to say it. He continued, "Once the camp is secured, we move on the landing pad. It's our only path off this rock, and the Dominion's only lifeline. We take a gunship. We disable the Dreadnought's tether controls. And then," his voice lowered, becoming steel, "we end this." Silence filled the room. Not fearful silence. Determined silence. Reeve nodded. "Positions." They moved. The first phase began with a whisper. Literally. A single shrill whistle echoed through Barracks 3. Civilians rose instantly, guided by veterans into neat rows. They filed into the maintenance tunnels beneath the colony, clutching blankets, canteens, and each other's trembling hands. Some children cried softly, confused and afraid. Their parents soothed them with promises that everything would be all right. Reeve walked among them, speaking soft words of reassurance. He touched shoulders, steadied shaking arms, met frightened gazes with calm ones. He didn't tell them not to be afraid. Fear kept people alive. When the last civilian disappeared into the tunnels, the veterans remained. Reeve exhaled once. "Begin." At that exact moment, synchronized down to the breath, Mara and 3 others slipped into the coolant control hub. They rerouted pressure valves and fired a pulse that overloaded the eastern sensor grid. Lights flickered. A distant hum sputtered. The Dominion technician monitoring the grid frowned. "Strange, Sector East just dropped." His superior waved him off. "It's been glitching for weeks. Fix it in the morning." The technician shrugged and turned away. Mara allowed herself a thin smile. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 began at the comm tower. Tarek approached the maintenance node alone, hands shaking as he swiped his ID badge. The security light blinked green. The hatch hissed open. He stepped inside. The tower interior hummed with energy. Blue coronas danced along conduits. Dominion engineers loved redundancy, but also loved convenience, and the override circuits were easily accessible from the walkway. Tarek approached the first node and hesitated. This was treason. There was no going back now. He thought of his brother, and he cut the first wire. Silence pulsed. Then he cut the second. The tower's status lights winked out one by one, cascading like falling stars. Across the camp, Dominion systems flickered. Patrol helm displays glitched. Surveillance feeds froze. Command consoles beeped with error messages. The camp commander slammed a fist against his console. "What's wrong with this cursed equipment?" His technician scrambled. I don't know, my lord. It appears to be cascading failures." "Fix it," the commander snarled. "Yes, my lord." He didn't fix it, because Reeve and the veterans were already in motion. Phase 3 erupted from the shadows. The first guard patrol never saw them coming. As 4 Gorath soldiers marched past the ore refinery, a vent panel slid open above their heads. 2 veterans dropped silently, landing with practiced precision. One clamped an arm around a Gorath's throat, cutting the air supply. Another struck the second guard's helmet with a reinforced mining clamp, sending him sprawling. The third guard whirled, but 3 more veterans surged from the darkness, tackling him to the ground. It was over in 5 seconds. No screams. No gunfire. The Dominion would find the unconscious guards hours too late. At the southern gate, 2 overseers lounged near the watchtower, complaining about rations. They didn't notice Jace creeping along the support beams above. A single well-aimed drop sent a heavy equipment crate crashing onto their heads. By the time the alarm lights flashed, the veterans were gone. The Dominion grew uneasy. "Patrol 3 is overdue. Patrol 4 isn't responding. Comms still down. Surveillance frozen." The camp commander barked orders, but every instruction collided with another failure. Dominion systems were designed for brute force, not subtlety. When the subtlety failed, the brute force had no direction. Reeve moved through the shadows like a man returning to his natural habitat. He felt older, slower, but also clearer. Purpose sharpened him. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down a corridor. He signaled his team to flatten against the wall. A squad of Gorath marched past, muttering, "Something's wrong. Should call the dreadnought. Can't, comms are dead." Reeve's team let them pass. Not every fight needed to be fought. Some battles were won through patience, others through silence. But soon, silence wouldn't be enough. The path to the landing pad loomed ahead. The landing pad was a fortress of steel and reinforced plating, guarded by 24 Gorath soldiers and a sentry mech. Floodlights swept across the pad, their beams sharp and bright against the night. Mara whispered, "We'll never breach that head-on." "Agreed," Reeve said. "But we won't be going head-on." He pointed toward the coolant pipes snaking beneath the pad. Earlier that day, Mara had rerouted half the facility's coolant reserves toward those very pipes. "On my mark," Reeve whispered. In the darkness below, Mara triggered the release. A geyser of freezing vapor erupted from beneath the pad, engulfing the sentry mech. Metal screamed as the machine seized, joints cracking under sudden temperature shock. The mech collapsed with a thunderous crash. Gorath soldiers shouted in alarm, firing blindly into the mist. Reeve and his team moved. They burst through the haze like ghosts, tools in hand, not weapons. A vibro cutter sliced through a rifle. An ore hook yanked a soldier off balance. A reinforced drill casing struck a helmet, sending its wearer sprawling. The veterans didn't fight like miners. They fought like an elite unit that had survived too many battles to count. Every move was efficient. Every strike calculated. They flowed together as though gravity itself bent around their coordination. Gorath soldiers, despite their size and strength, faltered under the assault. They had trained to fight brute force, not coordinated precision, not humans who fought with their hearts as much as their hands. A soldier lunged at Reeve, claws bared. Reeve sidestepped, seized the alien's arm, twisted, and slammed him against the pad railing in one fluid motion. Another charged Mara. She ducked under his swing, drove her knee into his plating, and jabbed a power cell into his belt. The overload sent the alien stumbling backward in a shower of sparks. Within minutes, the landing pad was theirs. The gunship sat in the center, sleek and dangerous. Their ticket off the colony. Reeve turned to Tarek, who had followed at a distance, fear warring with determination. "Can you unlock it?" Reeve asked. Tarek nodded shakily and sprinted toward the control panel. His claws flew across the interface. Dominion script scrolled rapidly, error messages flashing. "Hurry," Mara hissed. "I'm trying," Tarek snapped, panic creeping into his voice. "It's not designed for cross-species access." A soft chime. The gunship hatch hissed open. Reeve clapped Tarek's shoulder. "Good work." Inside, the gunship smelled of ozone and cold metal. Panels pulsed with blue and red lights. Tactical holodisplays flickered. The veterans took positions instinctively, as though decades had not passed since they last operated military hardware. Reeve slid into the pilot's chair. The controls were alien, but principles were universal: thrust, yaw, pitch, stabilizers. It came back to him like an old language he hadn't spoken in years. "Everyone ready?" Reeve asked. "Ready," Mara said. "Ready," Jace echoed. "Are ready," Tarek added. Reeve exhaled slowly. "Then let's finish this." He activated the engines. The gunship roared to life. And in the distance, alarms finally screamed. The Dominion had realized, far too late, that their labors were no longer bending. They were rising. The gunship rose from the landing pad in a plume of heat and dust, engines roaring as though announcing humanity's defiance to the entire sky. Floodlights snapped toward it. Sirens screamed across the colony. Goroth soldiers poured out from barracks and control posts, weapons raised in panic and disbelief. Reeve gripped the controls, jaw clenched. The unfamiliar layout of the Dominion dashboard flickered with hostile glyphs, but he navigated by instinct. Motion, energy flow, thruster modulation. The body remembers what the mind fears it has forgotten. "Stabilizers online," Mara called from the auxiliary console. "Shields warming," Jace added from the engineering station. Tarek hovered behind Reeve's chair, heart pounding loud enough that Reeve swore he could hear it. "2 Dominion sentry turrets arming below." Reeve banked left hard. The gunship lurched violently as plasma bolts tore through the air where they had been moments before. The ship surged upward, bursting through the perimeter haze with a furious growl of engines. Reeve angled them toward the sky, toward the stars, toward the massive shadow looming across the horizon. The Dominion dreadnought. It hung above the colony like a floating city, enormous and cold, engines aglow with terrible beauty. When it came into view through the forward viewport, even the veterans paused. It was easily 20 times the size of the colony. Its hull bristled with weapons capable of turning continents to ash. Reeve inhaled deeply. "That's our target," Jace swore under his breath. "I forgot how big those things are. They're not meant to be taken by force," Tarek whispered. "Not even by Goroth. They're built to be feared, never challenged." "Everything breaks," Reeve replied. "Everything." Below them, the colony shrank into a patchwork of metal and dust. Panic rippled across the landing pad as Dominion troops scrambled to active defense stations. The gunship screamed past them, leaving trails of ionized air. A broadcast suddenly crackled to life. A harsh, guttural voice amplified across a channel Tarek hadn't disabled. "Attention unidentified craft. Power down and prepare to be boarded. You are in violation of Dominion protocol." Reeve didn't answer. Another voice crackled through. "Theta 9 workers, you will be punished for this rebellion. Surrender now and executions will be limited." Jace smirked darkly. "Generous of them." Mara leaned closer to the console. "Distance to docking perimeter, 100 kilometers." Tarek gulped. "They'll fire as soon as we cross the threshold." Reeve's eyes narrowed. "No, they won't." The dreadnought loomed closer, its underbelly stretching across the horizon like a massive iron horizon. Surface lights glowed dimly. Docking bays opened and closed with mechanical precision. "You're not actually thinking," Mara began. Reeve was. He aimed the gunship straight into a stream of incoming or transports drifting toward the dreadnought's primary hangar bay. The transports were enormous, lumbering, and slow, but they created one thing the veterans desperately needed: cover. Reeve jammed the gunship into the formation, engines flaring as he matched their speed. "Hide in the convoy," Jace said, impressed despite himself. Classic smuggler trick. Smugglers didn't invent it, Reeve muttered. The Navy did. Plasma flak erupted around them as the Dominion opened fire, but the Dreadnought's targeting systems couldn't risk hitting their own transports. Instead, it fired warning bursts, trying to force the rogue gunship to peel away. Reeve didn't. The Dreadnought loomed larger and larger until it filled the entire viewport, a metal world blotting out the stars. The hangar entrance yawned open ahead, a glowing rectangular maw. Tarek's claws dug into the chair. They're going to identify us. They'll scan. I disabled the beacon, Reeve said. How? Very carefully, Reeve replied, which was only half true. The rest was luck and veteran intuition. The gunship glided into the hangar bay with the ore transports, slowing as magnetic clamps engaged to soften the landing. Dominion workers rushed across the deck, shouting instructions in their harsh language, unaware that death had just landed among them. The landing struts touched metal. Reeve breathed out. We're in. Not a cheer. Not a celebration. Just the quiet acknowledgement that they had crossed into danger far beyond anything they faced before. Because now, they needed to take the Dreadnought. From the inside. The gunship hatch opened with a hiss. Reeve stepped out first, eyes sweeping the bay. Dozens of Gorath workers and deckhands bustled about, dragging cables, refueling transport thrusters, checking automated loaders. None were armored. None expected resistance. Perfect. Reeve motioned silently. The veterans fanned out, slipping among crates and machinery like ghosts. Shadows clung to their movements. Their improvised weapons, drill heads, vibro cutters, power rods, glinted in the low light. Tarek stepped out hesitantly. Reeve caught his arm. Stay close to me. Tarek nodded quickly. The veterans moved with eerie smoothness. They had once infiltrated bases under far worse conditions. The Dreadnought interior was practically civilized by comparison. A Gorath deckhand approached, brows furrowing. What unit are you? Mara grabbed him from behind, muffled his cry, and dragged him behind a cargo stack. Jace secured the unconscious alien with cable ties he'd snatched from a toolkit. More workers fell silently. No alarms sounded. The veterans seized uniforms, access cards, and a datapad containing flight deck layouts. They regrouped behind a towering or container while Reeve skimmed the schematics. Bridge is 12 decks up, he murmured. We need to avoid main lifts, too exposed. There's a maintenance shaft here. Mara pointed at the display. Narrow, but it runs parallel to the fusion conduit. Jace grimaced. Which means radiation. Not enough to kill us in an hour, Mara said. Probably. Encouraging, Jace muttered. Reeve closed the datapad. It's our best route. Move. They slipped across the hangar bay as alarms continued flashing from the colony down below, still drawing Dominion focus away from the infiltrators. The maintenance shaft access panel was unguarded. Most Gorath avoided these corridors. They were cramped for larger species. Humans, however, could move through them with ease. Inside, the shaft buzzed with the hum of energy coursing through conduits. The thin metal walls vibrated faintly. Heat washed over them. They climbed. For 20 minutes, they ascended rung after rung in near blackness, illuminated only by a faint emergency strip lighting along the bottom ridge. The shaft narrowed as they ascended, squeezing them tighter. Tarek struggled, claws scraping nervously. Gorath aren't meant for confined spaces, he whispered. Reeve looked down. Stay focused. Don't look anywhere except the next rung. But what if? The only thing that matters is the next rung, Reeve repeated, calm but firm. Tarek swallowed and kept climbing. Veterans said nothing, but they felt sympathy. They'd seen good soldiers freeze in choke points before. Tarek hadn't been trained for fear. They climbed until sweat dripped down their backs and their arms trembled. At last, they reached Deck 5. Reeve pried open the hatch. The corridor beyond was dim, unoccupied, sterile metal floors, red emergency lights casting long shadows. Usually, a dreadnought would teem with movement. but most of the crew had been dispatched to respond to the colony uprising. Fortune favors the desperate. Deck 5 held the support systems, engineering controls, atmospheric regulators, secondary weapons routing. 3 Goroth technicians stood near a console, arguing loudly about the calm blackout. Never seen a cascade failure this large. Must be sabotage. From miners? Impossible. Reeve reacted before the last word finished leaving the alien's lips. He surged forward, striking the nearest technician with the edge of his tool. Mara and Jace followed, disabling the other 2 before they could shout. They dragged the unconscious bodies into a maintenance alcove and locked the door. Tarek stood trembling. That console, can it isolate the internal sensors? Mara scanned it quickly. Yes, but only locally. Do it, Reeve said. Mara's fingers danced across the Dominion interface. Her understanding of alien systems wasn't perfect, but Terran military tech shared enough universal principles that she could infer the rest. The deck-wide scanners flickered, then blinked off. Lights dimmed. The corridor darkened. They had carved a blind spot. Jace grinned. Beautiful. Don't celebrate yet, Reeve replied. 4 more decks to go. They moved deeper into the ship. Deck 4 had patrols. Not heavy ones, just pairs of Goroth soldiers marching side by side, muttering about how tiresome humans were, how soft and breakable, how this rebellion was a waste of time. Reeve halted their group at a junction. Let them pass, he whispered. The veterans pressed against the wall, barely daring to breathe as the soldiers stomped past. Their shadows stretched long across the floor, snaking like dark fingers around the humans' boots. A single twitch could give them away. A dropped tool, a sharp breath. But the veterans had mastered the art of stillness decades ago. The patrol passed. The humans continued. They didn't attack unless necessary. Efficiency was survival. Avoiding conflict was as important as winning it. On Deck 3, they encountered their first real obstacle. A blast door. Sealed. Reinforced. No access panel on their side. Can we bypass it? Mara asked. Not without a plasma cutter, Jace said grimly. Tarek stepped forward. I think there's a manual override behind that panel. Reeve looked at him. You think? Yes? Tarek squeaked. Well, Jace muttered. Good enough for me. Tarek pried open the small panel with shaking claws. A tangle of luminous cables lay within. He hesitated. Reeve placed a steadying hand on his back. Remember what you said earlier. The Dominion uses everyone. Break that cycle. 1 wire at a time. Something steadied inside Tarek. He exhaled and pulled. Sparks danced. The blast door hissed, then slid open. Jace whistled. You might survive this after all, kid. Tarek sagged with relief. They continued their ascent. Deck 2 held the barracks for the Dreadnought's elite honor guard. 20 armored Goroth warriors slept in staggered shifts across rows of bunks designed for their massive frames. Their weapons were propped neatly against the walls. Plasma pikes, rail carbines, heavy shock mauls. Reeve halted the team outside the door. We can't take them head on. We bypassed this deck entirely. Ventilation duct? Mara asked. Jace shook his head. Too loud. The armor they wear amplifies sound. They'll hear us. Reeve scanned the ceiling. There, an access hatch to the upper service rail. Up, he whispered. Veterans formed a ladder with their bodies, knees, backs, shoulders forming steps. Reeve climbed first, then reached down to pull Mara up. Jace followed, then Tarek, nearly slipping before Reeve caught his hand. They crawled silently across the service rail above the sleeping Goroth. One alien stirred below, snorting loudly. Tarek froze. Reeve's hand touched his arm. Gentle reassurance, not force. The guard rolled over and fell back asleep. They continued. When they reached the far side, they dropped quietly into an empty corridor that curved upward toward the bridge. Deck 1 loomed. The final barrier. The bridge doors were tall, imposing, and guarded by two elite sentries in full combat armor. Their expressions bored, their stance relaxed. The rebellion on the colony was a minor annoyance. Nothing more. Arrogance blurs vigilance. Reeve gestured for Mara and Jace to flank left. Tarek stayed close behind him. They stepped into open view, disguised in the stolen deckhand uniforms. One sentry barked. "What are you doing here?" "This deck is off limits." Reeve didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hand moved faster than the sentries could process. A vibro cutter slashed across the first sentry's weapon arm, severing tendons beneath armor joints. Mara swept the second guard's legs and jammed a deactivated power cell into his breathing vent, stunning him instantly. 2 seconds. 2 enemies down. Reeve dragged their bodies behind a pillar. Mara keyed into their helmet systems to disable their identifiers. Then Reeve approached the bridge door panel. Tarek whispered, "Bridge access is restricted to command signatures. We'll need a commander's." A heavy footstep echoed from the corridor behind. A Dominion officer rounded the corner, snorting disdainfully at the humans in stolen uniforms. "You! Why are you not at your—" Reeve stepped forward as though bowing, then struck the alien across the head with the sentry's own shock maul. The officer collapsed. Reeve knelt and pressed his hand to the alien's command gauntlet. The gauntlet scanned his captive's biometrics. The bridge doors hissed open. They entered. The bridge was vast, circular, lined with crew pits and holographic displays. Officers rushed between consoles, barking reports about the colony uprising. No one expected an attack here. Reeve and the veteran stepped inside with calm certainty. For a split second, no one noticed them. Then the commander at the center of the bridge turned. He was massive even by Gora's standards, armor-plated, helm crowned with jagged spikes. His eyes burned with contempt the moment he saw the humans. "You," he snarled. "Miners. Laborers. Frey." Reeve didn't answer. The commander raised his weapon, but the veterans moved first. They flowed into formation like a tide, silent, seamless, lethal. Mara swept left, Jace right, Reeve forward. Their improvised weapons flickered with deadly precision. The commander fired. Reeve spun behind a console, sparks erupting as plasma scorched the metal. Mara hurled a reactor rod that struck the commander's elbow joint. He roared as the armor cracked. Bridge officers panicked. "Security to the bridge! Breach! Breach!" Jace vaulted over a railing, tackling an officer before she could hit the alarm. Tarek rushed to the command console, claws flying across the interface to seal blast doors and jam cone lines. "You're dead!" the commander bellowed, charging. Reeve met him head-on. He ducked under a wide swing and jabbed his vibro cutter into the commander's side. Armor sparked but held. The commander grabbed Reeve by the throat, lifting him off the ground. Humans gasped. Mara cried out, "Reeve!" But Reeve didn't panic. He drove his knee into the alien's elbow, once, twice, 3 times. The joint buckled. Reeve dropped to the floor, rolled, seized the commander's own shock maul, and slammed it into the alien's ribs with every ounce of strength left in his bones. The commander staggered. Reeve struck again, and again, until the massive Gorath fell to one knee, gasping. "You," he coughed. "You're just laborers." Reeve leaned close, voice low and steady. "No, we're human." He struck one final time. The commander collapsed, unconscious. Silence filled the bridge. Then the veterans turned to the remaining Dominion officers. Many dropped their weapons. Some simply froze in terror. Reeve stood tall, breath heavy, sweat dripping down his brow. "This ship," he said, voice ringing across the command deck, "is ours." With the commander subdued, Tarek accessed the ship's internal comms and broadcast a message across the dreadnought and toward nearby Dominion-controlled colonies. A hologram of Reeve appeared in every corridor, every cell block, every barracks. "To all those held in chains," he said, voice steady as stone, "you are free. The Dominion no longer controls this vessel, and they will not control you. Gasps, cries, and cheers echoed through the ship as enslaved workers of multiple species looked at one another in disbelief and hoped they hadn't dared to feel in years. Rise, Reeve said. Stand. Walk out of your cages. Then he added the words that shook the sector. The Dominion can bleed. Across the dreadnought, enslaved beings rebelled. Doors opened. Guards were overwhelmed. Relief and fury washed through hallways like a flood. The impossible had happened. A mining colony had taken a warship, and the galaxy knew. Hours later, the veterans stood on the bridge. The dreadnought was quiet now, its systems under human control, its crew subdued, its prisoners freed. Mara inspected the tactical screen. Messages are spreading across nearby systems. Uprisings everywhere. Jace chuckled weakly. Never thought I'd see something like this again. Tarek stood beside Reeve, awed. You did it. You actually did it. Reeve shook his head. No, we did it. Humans and Gorth both. Tarek's throat tightened. Reeve stepped forward, looking out at the stars through the panoramic viewport. He spoke softly but clearly. We were miners. We became soldiers again. But tomorrow... He placed a hand against the cool glass, watching the constellations shift. Tomorrow we build. The veterans gathered around him. Behind them, the dreadnought hummed, no longer a symbol of Dominion power, but a beacon of liberation. A reminder to every species in the galaxy. Humans may bend, but we do not break. And when we rise together.